You don't need a stand mixer to make beautiful bread like this. Let me show you how to make Japanese milk bread completely by hand.
We'll start by making the Tangzhong. Tangzhong is one of the key elements of this bread. It's what makes the loaf soft, light, and keeps it fresh for much longer. The idea is simple. It allows us to incorporate much more liquid into the dough than we normally could. We combine a small amount of flour with a large amount of milk and gently heat the mixture. As it's heated, the flour absorbs a much larger amount of liquid. At around 65 to 70 degrees Celsius, it turns into a thick paste. That's what gives this bread its incredible softness. You can even prepare the Tangzhong the day before. I usually make it right before I start the dough. Transfer it to a bowl, cover it with plastic wrap, and let it cool completely. Always add it to the dough once it's cold. The wider the bowl, the thinner the layer, and the faster it cools. Now let's prepare the dough. For hand kneading, I always prefer a wide, shallow bowl. It gives your hands plenty of room to work. A deep, narrow bowl makes the whole process much harder. Add the milk and the egg to the bowl, then sift in the flour. I always sift the flour. It removes any small lumps, aerates it, and helps it combine much more evenly with the liquid. This is the first stage of flour hydration. We're not making a dough yet. We simply want every bit of flour to become evenly moistened. You'll end up with a soft, damp crumble. That's exactly what we're looking for. After you're done, cover the bowl with a towel and let it rest for about 30 minutes. When you come back, you'll immediately feel the difference. The flour has hydrated beautifully. Everything starts coming together, and it's already beginning to feel like a real dough. By now, the Tangzhong has cooled out completely, so we can add it to the mixture. I place it right in the center, wrap it with the crumble, and start incorporating it by hand. At this stage, we're simply finishing the flour hydration and distributing all the extra moisture evenly throughout the dough. We're still not developing gluten yet. We just want everything to come together into one smooth, evenly hydrated dough. Once it's combined, scrape down the bowl, cover it again with a towel, and let it rest for at least another hour. After an hour, let's come back to the dough and see what time has done for us. The moment you touch it, you'll notice the difference. It has turned into a beautifully soft dough that's ready for the next step. Now we'll add the yeast. Crumble it into very small pieces so it's easier to incorporate. Start mixing it into the dough in the bowl first. Then continue on the work surface. Once the yeast is evenly incorporated, add all of the sugar. For a short time, the sugar binds some of the free water in the dough. The dough may suddenly become stickier and even start falling apart a little. Don't worry, that's completely normal. This is also the stage where we're developing the gluten network that will hold all the gas produced during fermentation. Here you can see my favorite kneading technique. One hand rotates the dough while the other folds the edge back into the center. At this point, we're aiming for a smooth, elastic, slightly glossy dough that's ready for the next stage. Cover it with a towel and let it rest for another 15 minutes. While it's resting, prepare the last two ingredients, the butter and the salt. Mix them together into one smooth paste. It's important to add the butter only after the gluten has already developed. Anything we fail to develop before adding the butter becomes much harder to achieve by hand afterward because the butter coats the gluten network and slows down its further development. After 15 minutes, you'll notice the dough has already started rising slightly. Spread the butter mixture over the surface, and we'll move on to the most demanding part of the hand kneading. Incorporating butter into the dough is probably the most difficult part of kneading dough by hand. Once you've spread the butter evenly over the surface of the dough, start using exactly the same technique as before, folding the dough from the edges back toward the center. After a few seconds, or maybe after the first minute, you'll notice that the dough starts breaking apart. It almost looks like it's falling to pieces, and you'll probably feel like you've ruined everything. You haven't. This is completely normal. The only thing you need to do is keep going. Keep working until the butter and the salt are fully incorporated into the dough and it becomes smooth, soft, glossy, and beautifully elastic. Exactly the same stage happens inside a stand mixer. The difference is that you usually never see it, and more importantly, you never get to feel it. One of the biggest advantages of kneading dough by hand is that you can watch every stage of its development, and you can actually feel it through your hands. Personally, I believe your hands are one of the most important tools in both baking and pastry. They allow you to understand what's happening inside the dough. You can feel when it's become stronger, you can feel when it's become softer, you can feel how elastic it is, how firm it is, how the gluten network is developing, and how the butter is gradually becoming part of the dough. Step by step, you learn to recognize every change happening inside your dough, and that's exactly what allows you to become better and better every time you make it. When the dough is inside a stand mixer, all you do is change the speed. You never really feel what's happening inside the dough. That's why learning to knead by hand first gives you experience that will continue improving all of your baking in the future. As you can see, the dough has finally come back together. The butter and the salt have been fully incorporated. Beside the technique I'm using here, you can also use the slap and fold method. Personally, I find it works much better with larger batches of dough. With a small amount of dough like this, it's a little more complicated, but it's perfectly possible. Now you can see that we have a beautiful, smooth and elastic dough. Cover it with a towel and let it rest for another 15 minutes. After those 15 minutes, we'll knead it one more time. First, we'll press out the gas that has formed inside. At the same time, we'll even out the temperature throughout the dough, strengthen the gluten network once again, and tighten the dough back into a smooth ball. You can already see how it becomes smaller again. Cover it with a towel once more time and let it continue fermenting. In the meantime, we'll prepare the baking pan. I decided to use a thin stainless steel gastronome pan. It doesn't have any non-stick coating, and honestly, it isn't the ideal pan for baking bread. That's exactly why I'd like to show you how I prepare a pan like this before baking. If you're using a loaf pan that you already know releases your bread perfectly every time, you can simply skip this chapter and move on to the next one. But for everyone else, and for anyone who's curious about preparing a stainless steel pan like this, let's get started. The first step is to grease the pan with butter. Sometimes, butter alone isn't enough. The bread can still stick to the pan, and getting it out afterwards can become much more difficult. By the way, you can use exactly the same method for almost any type of cake or batter. Whether it's a sponge cake, a butter cake, a loaf cake, or almost anything else, this is a great way to prepare your pan before baking. As you can see, I've placed a sheet of baking paper over the entire top of the pan. Make sure you cut a piece that's large enough because it has to reach all the way down to the bottom. Use a few clips to hold the paper firmly in place. That allows you to make all the cuts you'll need so the paper can fit perfectly inside the pan. The goal is to cover not only the bottom but every wall of the pan all the way to the top. My loaf pan is quite tall. That was completely intentional because I wanted this bread to have plenty of height, and the pan definitely helps achieve that. Once you've finished making the cuts, remove the paper from the outside and place it inside the pan. The butter we spread earlier now works almost like glue. It holds the baking paper in place so it doesn't slide around while you're fitting it. I always start by positioning the bottom as accurately as possible. Once I'm happy with that, I take a pair of scissors and trim away the paper that's sticking out above the rim of the pan. Then I smooth the paper against each side of the pan and trim the top once again until it's perfectly level with the edge. This isn't only about making it look neat. There's a practical reason for doing it. Any paper sticking up above the edge of the pan will disturb the airflow inside the oven. That can noticeably affect the way your bread bakes or anything else you're baking in that pan. The effect is even stronger in a fan-assisted oven than in a conventional static oven. But in both cases, it's worth removing every piece of paper that extends above the rim. Once that's done, all that's left is making a few final cuts inside the pan. The paper should lie flat against the walls while overlapping neatly wherever the pieces meet. Simply trim away the pointed corners wherever the paper overlaps itself. If you plan to keep using the same pen over and over again, there's a little trick that saves a lot of time. Once you finish lining the pan, take the paper back out. You can either keep it as a template or trace around it. The next time you bake, you can cut the paper before you even start preparing the pan. You can even prepare several sheets in advance. Then, whenever you need one, you simply pick it up, place it inside a pan, and your loaf pan is ready for baking in just a few seconds. Of course, if you're using a ceramic loaf pan or another pan that releases bread easily, greasing it with butter is usually enough. You can also use non-stick loaf pans. Personally, though I'm not their biggest fan, and I only use them when I don't really have another option. Now your pan is perfectly ready and prepared for your Japanese milk bread. Let's take a look at our dough and see how beautifully it has risen. After about 45 minutes, although it was quite warm in the bakery that day, our dough has risen beautifully and it's time to divide it. Today I'm dividing it into 3 equal pieces. This time though, I decided not to use a scale. Instead, I'm simply dividing it by eye. I actually think this is a great exercise. It teaches you how to judge the amount of dough, recognize its thickness, and become more familiar with working by feel rather than relying on numbers. Of course, if you want, you can always check yourself afterwards on a scale and see how close you were. It's actually a fun little challenge. Now I'll shape each piece. Just like before, I fold the edges toward the center. Then I turn the dough over and tighten it against the work surface until I have a smooth round ball. Once again, we're pressing out the excess gas that has formed inside the dough. At the same time, we're strengthening it one last time before the final shaping. Place the 3 dough balls next to each other. If you like, you can lightly mist them with a little water, then cover them and let them rest for another 15 minutes. After those 15 minutes, we're ready for the final shaping. Lightly flour your work surface and dust the top of the dough with just a little flour. Take a rolling pin and start rolling each dough ball lengthwise. Try to use only as much flour as you really need. The goal is simply to prevent it from sticking while still allowing it to roll smoothly. Think about rolling the dough rather than stretching it. You don't want to pull it apart. You simply want to roll it out evenly. Once it's rolled out, fold one side toward the center, then fold the other side toward the center as well. At this point, I like to lightly brush the seam with a little water. That way I'm sure there isn't any dry flour trapped inside that could prevent the seam from sealing properly or allow the roll to open later. Now fold the dough in half once more. It's actually quite similar to shaping a baguette. Next, roll it out again, this time both in length and in width. Ideally, the width should match the width of your loaf pan. The thickness should be just under 1 centimeter. Again, work gently, don't force the dough. Rolling isn't about stretching it as much as possible. It's about taking advantage of the elasticity we spent all this time developing during kneading. Now roll the dough into a tight cylinder. Seal it firmly. Repeat exactly the same process with the other 2 pieces. You'll end up with 3 beautiful rolls. Place them into your prepared loaf pan. Always make sure the seam is facing down against the bottom of the pan, never upwards. Because I wasn't proofing the dough in a proofing cabinet, I simply misted it lightly with water. Then I covered it with a towel and left it to proof at room temperature. I judged the final proof by the height of the dough inside the pan. You'll see exactly what I mean in a moment. While the dough is proofing, prepare the egg wash. I like using a whole egg without adding any milk. I also always add a small pinch of salt. That salt helps break down the structure of the egg, making it more fluid so it spreads much more evenly over the surface of the bread. Once the egg wash is ready, simply wait until the dough has fully proofed. For me, the perfect moment is when the dough has risen to about 1 or 2 centimeters below the top edge of the pan. The dough should feel beautifully light and airy, but it should still spring back gently when you touch it. Proofing always depends on the temperature of your room. That's why it's impossible to give an exact time. Brush the entire surface carefully with the egg wash, every single part. If you leave even a small area uncovered, it will bake to a different color than the rest of the loaf. So take your time and coat the whole surface evenly. Now it's ready for the preheated oven, and this is the result. A beautifully golden Japanese milk bread. Leave it in the pan for just 2 or 3 minutes after baking. Then carefully lift it out and transfer it onto a cooling rack. You can see how easily it releases from the pan thanks to the baking paper. Now let it cool completely. Ideally leave it for several hours. You can even cover it with a towel and leave it until the following day. That gives the crumb enough time to finish settling and allows all the baking processes inside the loaf to complete naturally. After that, there's only one thing left to do. Toast this for your favorite sandwich or simply enjoy it as it is, with butter, with jam, or even with something savory. I really hope you'll give it a try, enjoy the process, and see you in the next video. Bye.